As many of us tonight, kind of surprised by that in only the second week. I know there are a couple people that we're going to miss this week, but on a regular basis, we're certainly very encouraged to have people be here on a regular basis. I know that maybe you can't make it every time, but this is one of our main ways of being able to interact, one of our main ways to answer questions and discuss material and things like that. So I don't like for people to miss out on it. Certainly, though, does speak well of those that are here. I would say that there's a good correlation of those that attend the live office hours regularly and performance in the class. Just, you know, it's correlation, not causation. That's a different scientific thing, but correlation in terms of more time with the material, thinking about it, talking about it, all of those things certainly help you to learn. Plan for tonight will be a similar plan to our usual meetings here. We'll kind of do a State of the Union type of thing and see how things are going in the course overall, go over any announcements, and then hit the highlights of some of the chapters or some of the topics that are on the schedule for that week. So in terms of highlights and things like that, there were some announcements and emails recently. I had sent out a reminder email and done an announcement about making contact with me. So if I hadn't seen somebody here or they hadn't emailed with me or whatever, we needed to make sure that they made contact with me so that we didn't have people that were signed up for the class that maybe forgot they were signed up or were somehow lost or something like that. We want to make sure that everybody is up and running. The other thing was you need to send some sort of an image to me. It doesn't have to be you. Could be of somebody or something else, such as you see with Aisha's photo, right? That is totally fine. But it'd be good to get something so that we have a face of something to go along with the name. And then I noticed that some people had put a photo as part of their profile on Desire to Learn, which is great because that's another place where we interact. But if you want to use the same photo, you certainly can. Just go ahead and send it to me as an attachment by email, and that way I can include it here too. Of course, we can also always see the little snapshot of it on Desire to Learn, but we can't really make it bigger than that. So if you haven't done that yet, make sure that you do. That was part of that initial assignment for the first week, is to check out the different online resources and communicate with me, let me know that you had done so, and send me one of those pictures. So make sure that that gets done. So Ted had a question about the lab assignment. So are we to turn in something to you, or is it that we just go through the material note for the exams, like the online library assignment? An excellent question. So we talked a little bit about that last week, but we haven't had an official lab so far. And if you look at the schedule, there is not one this week, but next week we have our first lab where we are completing the membrane transport lab in the PhysioX lab manual. So overall, the general pattern is that most of the labs will be completing exercises in the PhysioX lab manual, the computer simulations of different physiological experiments. Those exercises that you will do, and that'll probably be 80 to 90% of the labs that you do, those exercises that you do, as you were mentioning at first there, you go through the material and complete them, know it for the exams, you don't have to turn anything in. So you don't have to worry about tearing it out or scanning it and uploading it or anything like that. That being said, if you ever have any questions about it and you'd like to go over answers or something like that, you can always send me an email. You can send me your answers. You can type them up and send them to me. I can double check and go over them. We can discuss them in our discussion sections, things like that. But you don't have to turn anything in. As you mentioned, Ted, doing the exercises and being prepared for the lab section of each of the exams is the main intent there. So if you do the exercises, questions that will show up in the exam are kind of short answer questions related to the labs, and the questions would be similar to the questions that you find within the exercise or having to do with the large concepts that the exercise was trying to demonstrate. They won't ever be, very nitpicky questions like exactly what was the concentration of the, glucose solution that you were using in that experiment, or what was the minimum voltage that you used to get the muscle cell to contract. That's not important. Those are details that don't really have to do with the concept itself. Now, a concept of threshold and things like that, that's something different. But you're right, you don't have to turn anything in. Now, let me follow that up with, we said that the PhysioX exercises are about 80 to 90% of the different lab exercises that you're doing. There is a CD that goes along with the PhysioX lab manual. So you have to run the computer simulations. The lab manual itself is available in two forms. You can get it totally electronically. You can actually just access all of your different exercises online and run it from their website. Or you buy the lab manual, it has the CD in it, you run the CD off your computer, you answer the questions in the lab manual. But you've got to have some way to access those exercises to complete them. Now, like I said, 80 to 90% of the labs are going to be the PhysioX exercises. There are a handful of, handful of exercises that are lab exercises that you won't be doing in the PhysioX lab manual. So for instance, when we get to special senses, there are some activities having to do with testing your senses, both vision, mainly vision. And so there will be handouts provided to you. Again, you don't have to turn them in, you just need to complete them, make sure that you're ready for questions on them later on. There also, as Ted was talking about, there is a scientific article and library exercise where once we get into the exam 2 material, you'll spend time trying to find an article, a primary literature article, a scientific article on something that has to do with the human body. And you will do your searches through the electronic resources in the Moore Park Library. You'll find an article, you'll read it, and then you'll submit a summary of it. So that's one of the few cases where, number one, you're not doing a PhysioX exercise, and number two, you are turning something in. Because I want to see all these interesting things that you guys have found and read about them. So we'll upload those. But as we get closer to it, I'll remind you of that coming up. Again, that's part of what we do each week, is we look at what's kind of coming due on the schedule each week and make sure that everybody understands it, and also go over any questions that are associated with it. Okay. So along those lines, how are things going for everybody? Has everybody accessed lecture archives already? Has already been listening to different lectures? I see some yeses. I got 3 yeses so far. I got a yes from Ted. Monique has a hand up, so I'm guessing that means Max has a hand up, so I'm guessing that's a yes too. All right, who else? So Monique, Mariella, Megan, Lauren, David's all right. Carrie, how are you guys doing in terms of finding the lectures? You found them okay? Okay, so Lauren says she's been reading the lecture and the lecture notes, and that's good. I mean, to be sure, those are some primary resources for lecture material, for the main content of the course. That being said, you definitely do want to watch those videos. The lectures are, the way that we go over the material. It's another way, another mode or modality for accessing the material. And so I think that's pretty important. And you also, I look at my role in this course as helping you to understand what's in the book. Now, to be sure, if you're reading the book and that's fine, the content level seems fine, and you're understanding it and things like that, and you can assess that, that's totally fine. But the lectures, I think, certainly enhance it. Excuse me. So David has an excellent question. This is something we mentioned, but if you've got a question like this, then other people do as well. Okay, so Lauren, yeah, definitely do. And this goes along with David's question. So the archives that we have up there, in essence, I have a room, quote unquote, on the server at Blackboard. And so what happens is anytime I make an archive, like tonight I'm making an archive of this session, it goes onto the server. Now unfortunately, like Ted was talking about, we can't download them from the server. You can only stream it from the server. Another unfortunate part is I can't go in there and like relabel them. They automatically get loaded there, they're automatically available, and they automatically assign kind of a random name to them. It says that it's from me and it tells you the date, but it doesn't tell you what we were discussing, right? So it doesn't say like chapter 2 lecture or anything. So that being said, the lectures that you guys are using are some of the more recent files that are on there. The lectures that you guys are using are from fall 2011, okay? So what I did is I gave you a PDF on Desire to Learn of the schedule of the lectures when I gave them live in a year ago, okay? So the first one's going to be like August 23rd, 2011. So all of the archives that are on there, they start with the most recent ones, and then it scrolls all the way up till old ones, years old. So you're going to go to fall 2011, and you'll see them showing up twice a week, right? Because we were lecturing twice a week. You look at that schedule. I would say post the schedule, print out and post the schedule from fall 2011. Have it on your wall, have it on your desktop, something like that, so that you can look and see, okay, I want to hear the lecture in chapter 2. When did we do chapter 2? Okay, that was done, whatever, August 30th or something like that, 2011. So I'm going to look through the archives, I'm going to find the one that's August 30th, 2011, I'm going to click on the play button, and that's going to start streaming then from the server. All right, so definitely check those out if you haven't yet, and make sure that you can find them okay, make sure that they're streaming okay with the JavaScript and stuff like that, because that's the core content of this course. The book supplements it, it's a good repetition and things like that. The lecture notes, of course, are from the PowerPoint lectures that we do, and I'm going to be working on study guides or kind of objective questions for you guys to look at as well. But those lectures, like most classes, are going to be the core content, so you're going to want to get those. So make sure you check those out this week, so that if you have any problems, email me and we'll work that out. So Monique says, would you say the lectures will cover the material we should concentrate on more for the exams? I definitely would say that. So the lectures are based on the chapters in the book, right? Like I said, I see my role as helping you to understand the content that's in the book, because that's the content that you need to know. All right. So that being said, right, I can't read the book to you. You wouldn't want me to. So when I go through that, what I'm doing is kind of hitting the high points, and I'm going through the major concepts and the major details, and I'm doing my best to explain them and give you relevant examples and analogies and things like that. You'll find I'm big on analogies, because I think that helps to make links between what you already know and what you're trying to learn. And so, when I do my lectures, I'm going over the major concepts and physiology that we're going to be talking about in these systems. So most of what is important for the exams and for the content you're supposed to be learning in the class, you will hear about in those lectures. That being said, when I do the lectures, I can't hit every single detail. So reading the book is, number one, going to be able to fill in those details that I didn't have a chance to get to, and number two, it's going to give you that practice makes perfect, right? Seeing the material again and reading about it, and then putting two and two together with what you had seen in lecture. So that's very important. And remember, the lectures you can watch again and again. I'm not saying they're really exciting, but if you are not understanding a particular concept, like whatever, the sliding filament mechanism of muscle contraction, you can just rewind, go hear it again, read the book, look over the lecture notes, things like that. So, I'd say 80% of the material that you need to know for the exams in the lectures. And so there's only a very small amount of material that you might find on an exam that would be outside of what I covered in lecture. And the other aspect about it is, sometimes different textbooks are different, and sometimes they may tend to go into more detail on a particular topic than I think is necessary, or maybe there's something that I know about a particular topic that I feel is important, so I'll include that in lecture. So certainly use the lectures as a guide for what's important out of the chapter and what's important for the exam. Okay? So, sometimes I think that in these earlier chapters, on the one hand, even though it should be nice, easy, quote-unquote easy, review material, because it's mostly general biology, cell biology. On the other hand, I think that the authors in this textbook specifically, go into a little bit more detail on the chemical level and things like that than we really need. Okay? So do use the lectures to help guide you as to the more important parts of the chapter and things like that. I wouldn't cut anything out, but if you're trying to find out where to focus and concentrate, definitely the lectures are going to be your guide there. So, does that answer questions? Other questions? Aha, Christina says, what part do the animations play? That's an excellent point. The website, the book publisher website, they are, and most publishers are like this, they're generating a lot more study resources for students, and they have a number of animations that do a good job of really putting into motion some of these physiological processes, some of these chemical level or cellular level processes, which you really can't see. And so it's one thing to talk about, membrane transport or something like that, or the propagation of a neural signal down to a neuron in a freeze frame type description, but it's another thing to actually see it, moving. So the animations are up there, and depending on the chapter, there may be none, or there may be like 20. And so the animations are up there as study resources for you guys. And so they're nothing required. If they work for you and they really, make it much clearer, then, go back to those and use those. If you look at a couple and you say, it's not really for me, I'm more of an auditory learner or something like that, then that's totally fine too. So there are additional resources that I was able to get from the publisher and then put onto our Desire to Learn website. And I think they're quite helpful in bringing together, much like the tables and figures in the textbook, the animations really nicely summarize these things. Other things, a couple of typings going on there. It's a race to see between David and Lauren who gets their question out first. So the fill in the blank on your lecture notes, is that a key to know for the test or just another way to help us learn better? Yeah, more the latter than the former. Now so, it's one of those things that helps to keep you engaged. Sorry about that, I did not ditch you. So for some reason I got bumped off my wireless there. Don't be afraid, I'm back. I wasn't offended by your question or anything like that. So like we said, it's just a way of kind of keeping engaged. The blanks on the PowerPoint notes. It's a way of kind of keeping you engaged, but oftentimes those blanks are for significant vocabulary or terminology, and so they certainly could help with the exam too. We're not going to have necessarily a terminology section on an exam. It's possible, but they're mainly to keep you engaged there. Okay, and Christina, do you have a question? With your hand raised there? Must be going numb by now. Excellent question. I may not have seen your question, Lauren, because I got kicked off right then. So go ahead and type yours again. I don't think it came across. So Christina's question, one question and answer per chapter. Another excellent point. Thanks for bringing that up. So participation in the course comes from a variety of places. Number one, you're here now, certainly counts, right? There's a number of points associated with participation, so it's about 25 or so. So what you need to be doing, the main section of those 25 points, 20 out of those 25 points come from posting one question and answering a question in the discussion board. So it's basically one question and one answer per chapter. And you need to stay on top of that. The main thing is you need to post a question. Number one, it could be a study question you think is a good study question that people should know. Or number two, it could be a question that you don't know the answer, and so you want somebody to help you out. So you need to post a question, and then you need to answer somebody else's question. Now, you can answer somebody's question and make it for yourself, like a little quiz, and see if you can answer it without looking it up. But you should definitely, if you don't really know the answer, you should verify your answer by using reference like the book or the lecture notes in order to answer the question before you post it. So you need to be doing those, you know, about once a week, a little bit more, right? One for every chapter. So that way we're helping to kind of form community and stuff in these a little bit detached online classes, and then also you guys are helping each other out. You're thinking in the material, you're asking questions, you're answering questions, etc. So that is in the discussion section on desire to learn. So if you look at it, it's over in discussions, and if you click on discussions, you'll see a number of lists there. So you want to make sure that it goes into the right area for that particular question. So we have all the chapters listed, subheadings underneath each of the exams, and then there's also a section for lab discussion. So if you have a question about one of the labs, you can certainly ask there as well. Okay, so Lauren was saying she's finished through chapter 2, and there's a lot of information to cover, to be sure, and she plans on finishing 3 this weekend. Totally fine. You know, the schedule that we have is a suggested schedule. So if you were taking this class in-house, that's approximately how long it would take, or the time that would be dedicated in class to each chapter, right? Now, the beauty, if you will, of the online class is that you can set your own schedule. Now, the frequency should be regular, right? You don't want to do like a 3-hour lecture period, right? Just like you wouldn't want to sit in a 3-hour lecture period. You're not going to be able to watch 3 hours of lecture video and read all in one shot. So you want to spread it out. Generally, you want to spread it out in pace as well. So you want to make sure that you're not putting off too many chapters and things like that. You want to do a bit at a time. So that's important too, right? A little bit at a time to help digest it. So that's pretty important. So we're supposed to be in chapter 2 and 3 this week. So really, you're not far off there, right? So we're into chapter 3 this week, and then chapter 4 and chapter 5 next week. The following week is our first exam, right? September 4th. So what I'll be doing tonight is we'll be looking at some of the material in these chapters, kind of hitting the high points, and then answering any questions you have or anything like that. So do remember, right, when you're going through this, you've got to keep in mind that you've got both class time and study time, right? And this is a 4-credit class, so 4 credits is 3 hours of lecture and 3 hours of lab per week. So that's 6 hours of just class time, seeing it for the first time, etc. Then there's your study time, the time you're going to be reading the chapter, the time you're going to be going back through the lecture notes and writing up your own notes and things like that, okay? So that often is as much time as class time, if not twice as much. So an additional 6 to 12 hours a week. So you got to look at your schedule, see whether you're going to fit that in. Okay. So now the good thing about the beginning of the semester in this textbook is that they certainly give you guys a gradual kind of start to human physiology. So when we look at the chapters that are going to be included on exam 1, we got chapters 1 through 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. First one is just on homeostasis and feedback mechanisms and things like that. Second one is chemistry. Third one is cell, basically kind of cell and metabolism. Fourth one is membrane transport, where we start talking about cells and how they communicate with the external environment, etc. And then the fifth one is more details about specific ways that they communicate, like chemical messengers and how they bind those chemicals, etc. So, you know, with your backgrounds, you guys came from having a semester of chemistry and a semester of biology. So you've had courses that have to do with the chapters that we're going to be looking at first. Now that's not to, you know, to scare you in any way, but you should also, though, realize that these first 5 chapters in this first exam should feel fairly comfortable. Now, granted, you know, it's a prerequisite class, and who knows, it may have been a year or two that you took it, so it's not going to be on the tip of your tongue. That's why we're spending time in lecture, going over it for one chapter and reviewing it and things like that. But these are the things that that you've had some experience with already. When we get into the other exams and the other chapters, those things, it depends on whether you've had anatomy before, but those things are going to be less familiar, so it may require more time, etc. Okay? So this first exam and these first chapters should be kind of nice for you, kind of familiar. Okay? Still a lot of information, to be sure, but should have seen it somewhere before. Okay, so the first chapter gives us some introduction to homeostasis, gives us some introduction to feedback, gives us an introduction to terminology and places in the body where we're talking about the intracellular environment and the extracellular environment, etc. Okay? So homeostasis is this central concept about maintaining a stable internal condition. And all through this semester, we're going to be looking at different body systems and how they work to do that. What factor they're working to regulate, how they regulate it. And when we look at the control of these different factors, right, like pressure and temperature and glucose levels, each system is responsible for different factors or may work together with other systems in order to maintain a stable internal condition. Now that's not to say it's unchanging, right? So like body temperature, it's going to change in the day and night. It's going to change with activity level and stuff like that. But the intent of these different body systems is to make sure that those changes are as small as possible, and that when a change occurs, the body systems will work to push or nudge, if you will, the internal conditions back to where they should be, back to the set point. Okay? Now, one of the other things that we see in Chapter 1 is just kind of going over the organization of the body. But this, for those who have had anatomy, should be very straightforward, right? You've had weeks and weeks and weeks on different cell types and different tissue types and identifying them in the microscope, etc. But the reason that we go over it here is because it is so very important to understand things down at a cellular level and at a tissue level, because the tissues make up the organs, which make up the organ systems, which make up you. So even though we're looking at these organ systems on a chapter-by-chapter basis, we're always going to discuss these lower levels in order to understand how the organ system works, because it's these specialized cells that allow the tissues and the organs and the organ systems to perform their particular functions. So we go through a little bit of review of the different specific tissue types and the cells that are involved there, and then we start talking about the internal and the external environment. So what is inside the cells and what is outside the cells. Because that's going to be pretty important when we talk about tissues being together structurally and then producing a cohesive function together. Most of these tissues are going to have fluid or gel-like substance outside of them. That's going to be their intermediate for like receiving nutrients from the bloodstream or diffusing and getting rid of metabolic waste products or whatever. So what we're seeing in the beginning here is just the introduction of these systems, an introduction of the hierarchy overall, an introduction of this idea of homeostasis, which then, throughout the semester and throughout the different chapters, we will get into more specifics in terms of the systems, how they do their job, how they maintain homeostasis, etc. Okay? So again, talk about homeostasis and how it's maintained in a general way, different types of examples, talking about negative and positive feedback systems. So we'll find a lot of examples of negative feedback systems, very few of positive feedback systems, because negative feedback systems always work to go back to the set point, to maintain this internal condition. And usually there's a lot of very simplified kind of pathways, right, like a negative feedback pathway that will work to maintain that. And it doesn't always require conscious nervous system control. A lot of these are reflexes. Almost, it's not quite the same, but almost, you know, if you think about driving, which you didn't have to do because you're taking an online class, but if you're driving, when you drive, I assume you drive, you know, to stay in the lane, you're trying to maintain right in that area, right? There are small variations that occur. Maybe there's slope to the pavement. Maybe your tires kind of have a curve to them or something like that. You need to make small adjustments using the steering wheel. So if you start to drift towards the edge of the lane or out of the lane, you make a small adjustment with the steering wheel and it brings you back in line, right? You don't want to be doing big waves, you know, like big woo, back and forth, because that, number one, is going to waste a lot of energy. It's going to be very dangerous, and the body doesn't want to do that either, right? You want small nudges that counter initial changes or initial variance and bring you back in line. Okay, so we're just seeing different examples of that. All right, one of the other things that we get into in these early chapters is we're talking about cells. Cells are the smallest living unit that have these specialized functions that give rise to tissues and organ systems. In order for them to work together, they've got to be able to communicate. They're going to be physically linked in a lot of cases to form a tissue, but these cells will also need to communicate to each other locally and at a distance. And so there's lots of different ways that, number one, we can hold cells together, and number two, we can communicate between cells. Again, so that the communication is maintained and the coordination is maintained. Okay, then this chapter talks a little bit about the rhythms and the changes in some of these different factors, like changes in glucose levels, changes in oxygen levels, changes in temperature, but any of those changes should be, if the homeostatic mechanism is working properly, should be minimal. Okay, so chapter 1 is really kind of conceptual, laying the groundwork for where we're going to be going in the future. Chapter 2 gets a bit more detailed, talking about chemistry. So again, you should have a background for this already, but for chemistry, we're starting at a lower organizational level, right? The cells that we have, which are the smallest living unit, are made up of different types of molecules and ions and things like that, right? And so we need to understand it at a chemical level. Not that we need to be concerned with exactly each part of the cell or tissue and what it's made out of, but those cells that are performing their functions, they have, in their metabolism, they have different types of chemical reactions occurring, right? Synthesis reactions where they're building things, right, taking small building blocks and bringing them together. Decomposition reactions where they are breaking things down, like digestion, etc. And so we'll find multiple examples of chemical reactions occurring because that's how the cells do business. And so this could be how red blood cells bind oxygen in the heme group in the hemoglobin molecule. This could be in the digestive system, how different types of nutrients are broken down, how they're absorbed across the body wall and then transported in the blood. There's lots of different examples of chemistry that's going on because that's the work of the cell. Okay? So there's a review section here talking about things like elements. And so we talk about the elements of the atoms and what makes those up, right? The subatomic particles. So you need to remind yourself what's the difference between a proton and a neutron and an electron. You need to know atomic number and mass number. And the main reason that we're going through this is we're looking at these building blocks and we want to take it to the next step. So we go from atoms or elements to molecules. So we need to understand the atoms in order to understand how they might link to one another, how they might associate with one another in order to make molecules. Okay? So we talk about atoms, we talk about ions, and when they can lose or gain electrons, and when they do so, that gives them a charge. And charge, an association by charge, is one of the ways that we can form a molecule, one of the ways that we can link these atoms together. So we get into talking about different types of bonds. Okay? So when we look at different types of bonds, then we'll talk about, you know, covalent bonds and hydrogen bonds and ionic bonds and things like that, and what those mean, because that's how your different cells are going to be building things. But those are also how your cells, if they're going to decompose or break something down, they're going to need to break these bonds. Now the interesting thing about some of these bonds as well is it's not only how a molecule will be made, right? So for instance, like water molecules or salt crystals or something like that, but it's also the way, for instance, plasma membranes are assembled, and those more complex molecules are held closely to one another. It's also how things like proteins will have a particular shape that allow them to bind a particular chemical, like a hormone or an other type of chemical messenger. So we come back to that kind of as we get into the end of this chapter, and we get into chapter 3, we get into chapter 4 with membrane transport, etc. Now, one of the other factors that is regulated in the body that has to do with the concentration of ions in fluid has to do with acids and bases. So you need to remember what that means. And then we have a whole chapter on membrane transport. And so you need to know about how different substances are transported into and out of the cell. Because the cells are living things, they need to respond to the environment, they need to get nutrients, they need to get oxygen, they need to get rid of other things. And so transport across the plasma membrane is going to be big. Okay? Now we introduce, when we get to the molecular level, we introduce different types of molecules. Certainly we're going to see them again and again as examples of things, particularly proteins. Proteins are everywhere, used for all kinds of things. But we're going to see them in the main way again when we get to the digestive system, because these are your main organic molecules, and these are also the building blocks for our cells. And so in order to build more cells, we need to have more building blocks, more nutrients, and so we need the right types too. So we go into carbohydrates and lipids and proteins and nucleic acids. We'll also find that certainly ATP is another very important organic molecule as well. So we go a little bit into what the building blocks of carbohydrates are, what's the difference between simple and complex carbohydrates, how do we form them, see like dehydration synthesis, things like that. We pull water out, see the two components of water there, we pull the water out and make that bond that we see there. So you definitely need to know about the different organic molecule types, what they're used for, how we build them, etc. Proteins that, like we said, are everywhere. They're assembled with amino acids, and the chains of amino acids are very important in terms of what the protein's like, what it can do, what its shape is as well, and how those different amino acids are going to interact, like you see here. Different types of hydrogen bonds, ionic bonds, they can repel each other, and even covalent bonds too. And this is an example of one of our most well-known proteins, the hemoglobin molecule that binds oxygen in the red blood cells. Okay, so you got to remind yourself about DNA as well, and how DNA is a very important organic molecule, an ATP, and what it's used for, how we synthesize it, etc. Now we get more into that into chapter 3 because we talk about organelles, right? Kind of a next organizational level that synthesize ATP. We talk about how we create more DNA or how we copy DNA and RNA, etc. So let me do this really quickly. So far what we've looked at is chapter 1 and chapter 2. What I'm going to do, they only give me a certain capacity to be able to upload things. And so I've actually hit that capacity with these 2 chapters. So what I need to do is delete some pages so I can upload chapter 3 so we can look at the high points there. Let me work on doing that while you guys let me know about some potential questions that you may have. So how did it seem for you guys when you were looking at, I mean, I know that it's a lot of information still, but did it seem fairly familiar when you were looking at it, at least in terms of things like chapter 2 where you were talking about chemistry? I know as biology folk, we're not always comfortable with chemistry, but we do understand the necessity of it and how it plays a role. Yeah, not too bad. Yeah, that's good. So it's nice. I mean, like we said, it kind of sets the stage for things that we're going to see later on. And chapter 3 is like that too, because chapter 3 is going to tell us about the generic cell, right? How a generic cell does its job in maintaining itself and getting nutrients and getting rid of waste products and the different organelles and their particular roles. And then when we get to these different body systems, what we'll see are specialized cells. Specialized cells that are a little bit different and that therefore have very specialized functions that serve that tissue and that organ system. So rather than just a generic round cell or something like that, what you're going to find is we're going to find that, you know, when you look at a muscle cell, oh, it's totally different in terms of its shape and its structure. And that allows it to perform its particular functions, right? So this type of cell, the nerve cell, is going to be very different than some sort of epithelial cell or something like that. Okay, let me see if I can load some Chapter 3 slides now. So to be sure, as Ted was saying, you know, it always seems okay as you're just kind of looking over it, especially if you've seen it before, but you want to make sure, right, we're going towards the exams where you're going to be assessed on it. And so it's very critical that you guys, like in the discussion area and stuff like that, you guys see for yourselves how well you know it, okay? So you want to quiz yourself, right, do flashcards or something like that. We will have some quizzes along the way prior to the exam. The syllabus originally stated that we would have 5 different quizzes, and usually what I do is that it's a quiz that covers the same material that will be on the exam, but it occurs in the week previous, so you can see exactly what you know and what you don't know. That being said, I think we have 5 of those quizzes with 20 that are 20 points each. I think what I'd like to do is make those a little bit more frequent and a little bit smaller. So rather than doing like 5 20-point quizzes, maybe do 10 10-point quizzes instead that cover smaller amounts of information. Because like I said, the quizzes, they are, you know, supposed to assess what you know, right? But we want to do that at discrete intervals, at little chunks along the way, so that you can see what you know and what you don't know. And if you don't know something, that you have time to go back and study it some more or ask questions about it, etc. Okay? So I'll let you know about that as we get closer to a quiz date. But, you know, I might, for this first one, we might have a quiz, let's say, on chapters 1, 2, and 3, and then a second quiz on chapters 4 and 5. And that way it's not so overwhelming, and we can, again, see in a stepwise process how you guys are doing on things. Yeah, so so people are asking about tests and stuff like that. Yeah, I should be able to come up with an old exam and post it on there. Somebody send me a reminder email or send me a notification in D2L about that, and I can work on that. I'm still working on study guides as well, so I'll be working on those. Just trying still to get slides loaded up. It's still giving me a little bit of a hassle here. I'm going to try one more time to load those chapter 3 slides up. If they don't load up this time, I'll still go through it. I'll look through it on my computer and talk about the high points of it. Again, chapter 3 is on cell, and so it shouldn't be too bad in terms of the material, but I did want to bring it up as well and look at it since it's on the docket for this week. Okay, one more thing. Apologize for the delay there. Like I said, if I load up too many PowerPoint presentations, I hit the ceiling in terms of the capacity that it lets me do. Let me try one more here. I'm going to upload it again. Chapter 3 coming up. So the slides are loading up right now. You can't really do too much else. The Blackboard Collaborate doesn't let me do anything else on the screen while they're loading up. You can hear me, but any of the clicking or anything like that, I can't do anything else on the screen, navigating the window or anything. So, but I mean, looking forward, the chapter on cell, again, should be pretty basic. What we're going to be talking about is, you know, how the cell, on a generic level, maintains itself. And I'm talking about the organelles inside of it and what their particular roles are in keeping the cell alive. And that's certainly a good analogy for what we're going to be looking at for ourselves, right? We also are a living organism, a living thing, and we have smaller internal components that work to keep us alive and maintain us, right? So we have us, and we have our organs, we have our cells, and those have organelles, right? Mini organs inside of it. So again, it should be mostly reviewed. You're going to be looking at those different organelles, and you need to know what their particular functions are, what their roles are inside of the cell. Now, as you get towards the end of the chapter, where we start talking about those organelles that are associated with proteins and things like that, we do get some more details in terms of proteins and and RNA and transcription and things like that. So you will need to review that too. And then at the very end, we go into some processing like enzymes and things like that. It talks about ATP production, and with ATP production, this is a good example of how we would use the lecture exams to guide us into, how much detail we would need to know for the exam, right? Because the book goes into a fair amount of detail in ATP production. But you guys have already taken a course on general biology, which is basically cell biology. You've learned at one time, okay, all the different intermediate steps of respiration, cellular respiration, and so we don't need to do that again. And so when you look at the lecture notes, you'll see kind of what we can really focus on in terms of that, like ATP production. All right, so what I have done right now is I'm using the application share feature of CCC Confer. So you're seeing PowerPoints, I just didn't load them up. So you're going to see, you can actually see my pointer moving and things like that. For those that have a slower internet connection, sometimes that'll be a little slower, but at least we can see what we're talking about here. Okay, so there's our generic cell, right, in all of our different organelles. Now we go through the organelles at this point, but then, like we said, when we get into Chapter 4, we're going to start talking about things like the plasma membrane and how this cell communicates with the outside environment, the extracellular environment, and how this cell will communicate and relate to other cells. So we have a little bit of introduction to the cell membrane here, even in this chapter, but we really get into membrane transport and some specific examples of it later on. Okay, so you need to know different molecules that make up the plasma membrane, what roles they have, right? The lipid bilayer. And then there's tons of different proteins that are found in it, and they have different roles. We've got different ways, different examples of cell-to-cell adhesions, like you see here in this figure, figure 3-9, and they have slightly different roles. It's a very good example of structure and function, anatomy and physiology, right? So you have different types of cell-to-cell junctions that have different roles. Some specifically allow passage between the cells, and some make sure that we're not passing content, if you will, between cells, but also they're making sure that no ions or molecules or something like that would be able to pass in between the cells this way as well. So it's they have their own particular role. Okay, so then after that we kind of get into the tour, if you will, of the different organelles, the things we find in the cell and what they do. So certainly you're going to talk about nucleus. There's a more detailed section in terms of DNA and RNA, translation, transcription, etc. You certainly should be able to relay, not necessarily every specific step, if you will, in transcription or something like that, but be able to provide an educated description of, transcription, translation, and things like that. So here we're just talking about the organelles, like we said. So you need to know all the different organelles and what they do, okay? What they do for the cell. So lysosomes, peroxisomes, these very interesting things that we call vaults that they don't even know what they really do. When we get past organelles, right, organelles are mini organs. If we think about this living thing, it also needs to be able to move, it needs protection, just like we need to move and we need protection, like for our muscular and skeletal systems. So instead of bones, we talk about the different proteins associated with the cell and that help to make up its cytoskeleton. So we talk about different types of components of the cytoskeleton, different types of filaments and things like that. So you need to know the filaments, you need to be able to give examples of them, if you will, and what they do. So we can see a graphical depiction of them here. And you can see, right, good example of structure and function. Different sizes that will then have different tensile strengths, flexibility, or structure, etc. Okay. So there's so many of the organelles that are associated with protein and protein production, that's certainly a very important part of knowing what's going on in the cell, because many of those proteins are used by the cell itself, but many proteins in the body are exported. They're products that are produced by specialized cells that are then used outside of that particular tissue. They may communicate, right? It may be a chemical messenger like a neurotransmitter, could be a hormone, could be all kinds of different things. So you really need to know this idea of protein and protein production, okay? So how are they produced, how are they secreted, things like that. Then towards the end of that chapter is when it starts to get into some specific examples of proteins and what they're used for. So we start talking about things like enzymes and ligands or ligands, depending on where you're from, and how these different proteins, because of their shapes, can have different effects on cells. They form these lock and key type mechanisms where we can turn things on and off. We can, in essence, kind of amplify a particular activity of the cell. So there's a lot of ways that they are a control mechanism. And so much like the lock and key mechanism that gains access to your house or something like that, they also are type ways that we can regulate or modulate the activities that are occurring in the cell, or even bigger than that, in the body. So towards the end of this chapter, it gets into cell reactions, which is something that we were talking about in chemistry, but are certainly going to be important on a biological level, right? We said the cells are going to be synthesizing things or decomposing things, etc. And enzymes are going to be, in many cases, a very key component of that, because enzymes are going to lower that activation energy. It's going to make that chemical reaction occur easier. Okay? So you definitely need to know about enzymes, because later on, when we get to body systems, we're going to talk about specific enzymes. We're going to talk about enzymes like in the respiratory system that works to change carbon dioxide into bicarbonate so it can be transported around. In the digestive system, we're going to talk about enzymes there that aid in the digestive processes of breaking down our different nutrients, etc. Okay? All right, now like we said, the very end of the chapter it gets into anaerobic and aerobic production of ATP. Now, even though we've got these pictures up here that have some details to them, like this, okay, you don't need to know all the specific intermediates and things like that, okay? If you can summarize, let me see, what's this one? Nah, that's not as good. If you can summarize what's going on in terms of the 3 ATP production pathways, right? If you can summarize what's going on in glycolysis, you know, where it occurs, how many ATP are produced by it, what the building blocks are, what are the reactants that it uses initially, and what are the products that it puts out besides ATP. If you can summarize in that way all 3 ATP producing processes, right, glycolysis, Krebs cycle, electron transport chain, then you're fine in terms of what we need to know for ATP production and that type of cellular activity. Okay, now that actually takes you to the end of chapter 3 as well. Let me pop out of this and we'll go back. Okay, so any questions about what we were seeing tonight? A couple of people are typing. So Dave was saying as a quick review. On the flip side of the coin, Ted was asking about if these are generally about an hour long. I'd say yes and yes. So the discussion sections, like we said, so they're not to take the place of lecture. You've got lecture material already, right? But they're to enhance it so that we can, like I said, when we get into more complex chapters and systems and things like that, there's going to be usually some topics that are a little bit tougher that we want to spend a little bit more time on. Or if you have questions about, we want to go through it again and talk about it some more. So that's really what these discussion sections are here for. So we'll always answer specific questions and answers, which will probably, like I said, come up more later on. But then we'll also spend a little bit of time kind of thumbing through the PowerPoints and reminding ourselves of what are important topics in there and trying to highlight those. So the sessions are usually about an hour or an hour and a half, somewhere in there. Usually about an hour. In terms of questions at the back of the chapter, to be sure, any way that you can, again, spend more time with the material or spend time studying the material in different ways are going to be beneficial. So anything you have, you can talk to other people about it, you can make up flashcards. I'm working on the other study guides, etc. Alrighty, well, like I said, that's all that I had to cover tonight. I'll hang out. I usually hang out towards the end in case any other questions come up, so I'll be here. I will do some more posting on the announcements and desire to learn. Like I said, I'm going to probably come up with some smaller quizzes. I'm going to be working on study guides. I'm going to, somebody remember to send me an email about posting an example exam. So we'll get those things up there. So that means if we're going to have smaller, more frequent quizzes, 10-point quizzes or something like that, we'll need to get one for chapters 1, 2, and 3 probably early part of next week. Okay? So expect that. So much like Lauren was talking about, you need to kind of stay on track with things, stay on pace with things, and get into chapter 3 coming up. In terms of a reminder for posting things, you can, as soon as you log off here, if you want to send me an email, that'd be totally fine. If you don't see it in a day or so, a day or two, then send me another reminder email. That'd be fine too, but I'll be working on it in the next couple of days. Alrighty. Well, we will see you online and see you next week then.